This week, we speak with Hillel Solow from Checkpoint. In the news segment, Project Zero, adjust their disclosure policy. We ring in the new year with more insider threats, strategies for cert rotation, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 91, recorded January 13th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman.
Good morning. Happy Monday, Mike.
Happy Monday, Matt. Good to speak with you again. And guess what? We also have John Kinsella. It's his first appearance this year. Hey, John.
Happy New Year. I finally got out of bed for the new year.
That's good. Hopefully you're nice and well slept, so you're nice and refreshed for some good stuff to chat about for the rest of the year, actually.
Faux show.
Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020 and click the register button to register with our discount code. Our next webcast is January 15th with Cecilia Marinier, RSAC Program Director, Innovation and Scholars, where we will discuss the RSAC Sandbox, RSAC Innovation Sandbox, their Launchpad, Security Scholar, and their how-to seminar for innovators and entrepreneurs. Register for our upcoming webcast by visiting securityweekly.com. Select the webcast drop-down from the top menu bar and click Registration. Hillel Solow is passionate about security innovation and is currently driving product innovation and security as part of Checkpoint's CloudGuard Dome 9 portfolio. Having been recently acquired by Checkpoint, Hillel was the CTO and co-founder of Protego Labs, the leader in code-centric security for serverless. Hillel was also CTO in Cisco's IoT security group, where he worked on innovating security solutions for new technology markets. Welcome to the show, Hillel.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you here. And one of the things that we wanted to dive right into is we're talking about, you mentioned serverless and a lot of the work you've done with Protego, but we also want to look at, since we're starting off the year, some trends in DevSecOps and AppSec for 2020. So with that in mind, what's some of the things that are exciting you or are you looking forward to this year?
Well, I'm really excited about the shift that organizations are making to the cloud and in a really modern way, what people tend to call cloud native now, what that means for organizations, what that means for security, what that means for DevOps, what that means for how we build software. I really think this is the year where we're going to see a fundamental shift in how people build and deploy and operate software, and that's going to affect our on-prem deployments, but especially our cloud deployments. And for us, in Protego and now as part of Checkpoint, we're really excited about what that means for security, what some of the new opportunities are in security, and how we have to approach that to make things work.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things from a Checkpoint perspective is a couple years ago, I was sitting down with some of your biz dev guys before some of these acquisitions, by the way, hello. And I was asking them about what's Checkpoint's strategy when it comes to application security, right? You have the presence at the perimeter with the firewall. And at the time, there was this belief, I think, for a while that, as long as you had access to the perimeter and the endpoint, you were okay. But we've seen this dramatic shift in the market into more cloud native, into serverless, into containerization. And I think Checkpoint woke up pretty quickly and said, whoa, wait a minute, this world is moving that direction. And you guys made a lot of strategic investments over the last year and a half in this space to really position you a lot differently than you were, say, 2 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the interesting things to recognize is that when you move to securing the cloud, it's really not an extension immediately of what you do in the on-prem world. A lot of the things you mentioned, maybe especially the perimeter, those are paradigms that don't work so well in the cloud. And it was really necessary to adopt new paradigms and new techniques. And I think one of the things that happened here in Checkpoint over the past couple of years has really been a shift in mindset about how we approach cloud, how important cloud is strategically, but then also how do we approach cloud. I think you're seeing a shift away from let's take the things that we have from our on-prem world and see how we translate them to cloud, into a recognition that cloud is different. The way people look at cloud, the way people operate software in the cloud is different. And therefore, the way that people will need to secure the cloud is different. The relationship with the cloud providers is different than the relationship you have when you do things on-prem with your own team. And so it's really necessary to embrace new models of security. And I think the things you're seeing with some of the acquisitions that happened, but also some of the mindset shift that's happened inside the company, and I'm seeing it now. I'm kind of new here, but I'm already seeing how there's really been a big shift inside as to how we think about the cloud, how we think about customers who use the cloud. How do we talk as salespeople to customers using the cloud? Who are we talking to? What are we saying to them? What are the things that they're worried about? And then what's the technology stack that's going to help us get there? And obviously, some of that technology stack is going to be based on or built upon or even using things that we've done for 20 years in the on-prem and enterprise world. But a lot of them have to be reimagined or augmented with things like the acquisition of Dome9 and now Protego and some of the other pieces that really help.
So I'm going to ask a question there, and this might sound snarky. That's not the intention, but I think it's sort of interesting. I think this is going to show interestingly how the market moves. And that question is a little late to be getting on the cloud bandwagon, isn't it?
I don't know. You think that cloud thing's going to catch on? Really? I'm not sure.
Well, my point being, it's there's some of us in our little bubble, which we live in and out of this every single day, and we think everyone's doing it. But I suspect what you're going, not to put words in your mouth, but I suspect the greater sort of worldview which Checkpoint is looking at is a little bit different than that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think for me it's heightened because I've just made the transition from a very cutting edge, small, rapid startup to one of the world leaders in security, but also one of the world leaders in security by virtue of the fact that it's a relatively conservative company that moves cautiously, makes decisions slowly and carefully. And I think there's a lot of value in that, particularly as an enterprise customer. You're not necessarily looking for somebody who's sort of, jumping head first into cloud, throwing everything at the wall and trying to see what sticks. As an enterprise customer, particularly larger enterprise customers, you're looking for somebody to walk in and say, look, I figured this out. Here are the pieces you need. Those are the things you don't need. Let's not go crazy. And let's see if we can get you going with as few suppliers as possible and as few integrations as possible. So you're right that it's, the cloud's been around for a while, and how are we sort of showing up now, Checkpoint and some of the other, larger giants in security, and saying, okay, we've now figured it out. Here it is. But I think that's kind of the natural evolution of the way security works. Is there are smaller, faster movers early on that really define what the market is and what the market needs, and help sort of figure out that technology stack. And then there are larger companies that say, look, we can do this, but we can do this and operate it and sell it in a way that's meaningful for larger enterprises. And I think that's what Checkpoint's doing. So, would it have been better if maybe we'd made some moves earlier? Possibly, but I don't think it's too late for a company like Checkpoint to move into this space. I think it's the right time for Checkpoint to be saying, look, we've figured out what cloud means and how you need to do cloud. We've figured out what's different in that world and how we need to talk differently and act differently and provide different technologies. And here's what we think cloud is. And I think you're going to see over the next year a lot of moves from us around cloud and containers and serverless and all these other pieces that I think are going to really paint a meaningful picture about what cloud security is.
And I think that's fair, and I'll agree with you on that positioning. So, but I think what's interesting with you guys coming in there now, sort of layer on top of that, at least from what I'm seeing, is those companies which would be a little more conservative in their adoption, they're starting to look at serverless. So that seems like, at least to me, that's moving a lot quicker than I expected. Would again, not to act like the lawyer, but would you agree with that, or what are you guys seeing from your own neck of the woods?
Well, absolutely, and I mean, I think I'd love to pull up my investor deck from 2.5 years ago when we started to have a conversation. One of the things that I talked about when I spoke to investors, 2.5 years ago, was serverless is a little bit different than containers was, in the sense that we're already seeing, and this is 2.5 years ago, certainly today, we're already seeing large enterprises making steps into this. We're seeing financial institutions. We're seeing banks, banks like Capital One and HSBC and some others. We're seeing large enterprises like Coca-Cola and established startups like iRobot making really quick steps into this space. So I think, I think people were really hungry for a way to use the cloud that was more meaningful and useful than they've had till now. And I think serverless very rapidly became, I don't know about the way, but one of the ways that you can really properly go cloud native, as opposed to kind of lift and shift your virtual machines into the cloud. So I think we've seen a much more rapid adoption. I think that's what attracted me to the space to begin with. This notion of serverless is going to be different, cloud native is going to be different, security will be different. There's an opportunity, and also it's not going to be 5 years before anybody that's got more than 100 people in their company starts using it. So absolutely, and I think today 2020 is really where we're seeing that play out. Where just about everybody who's anybody building software is doing it in the cloud and is doing some of it serverless.
Yeah, Hillel, I have these conversations with investors often about the different security vendors. And one of the things I try to educate them on, and you hit on points in this, and I think it's really important, is the move to the cloud is different today than it was 5-10 years ago. 5-10 years ago, we were literally taking our servers in the data center and creating infrastructure as service in the cloud. We're not doing that anymore. We're actually moving things into platform and serverless capabilities where we've abstracted away aspects of the network, of the endpoint, by adopting these way more mature service offerings from the cloud providers directly. And to your point, the way you secure them is very different. We're not going to throw an agent in a platform as a service and say, oh, I can secure that, right? It's very different train of thought and a different approach. And what I'm hearing is, at least from a Checkpoint perspective, who's traditionally played in the network and some of the endpoint space, you've recognized customers are moving to these environments, and therefore the techniques need to change. Investors are still learning through this process, and I think it's good that everybody gets educated is how these how these applications, how these new services are really coming into the cloud, because they're very different.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I think as you guys are diving into this, that theme that's emerging is very much that serverless is really where people and organizations are trying to find the patterns, as well as, Hillel, you were saying that the security is different. I'm curious to dive into that a little bit, because different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse for that matter. So I'm curious, as you see organizations try to figure out how should they be using serverless, since they're not coming from a lift and shift, a quote unquote serverless that they might have had in their own data center, what are you seeing as either better uses for it or challenges they're running into, or even for that matter, a more optimistic look, what are some of the benefits that they're getting out of serverless?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, even if we put security aside for a second, I think serverless is very different than the way we operated in the cloud before. I think to some of the points made earlier, it's really a different paradigm for how we use the cloud. One of the challenges that organizations have is once they've gone serverless and they've accepted the rapid velocity and feature deployment they can get from serverless, it's really difficult to dial that back. And so even if there are costs that they're paying in security or observability or monitoring or operations or anything else, it's difficult to take a step back and say, actually we don't want to do that. So people are really moving quickly into the space and then getting kind of, I don't want to say stuck into it, but they're really enjoying the benefits in a way that makes it hard to move away from it. From our perspective, when we talk about security, I think there are a couple of things that happen. I don't think, and I think you said this really well, I don't think serverless is necessarily more or less secure than anything else. If anything, I would probably make the argument that serverless applications tend to be more secure than non-serverless applications. As a security startup, that wasn't always a great argument to make. You kind of sometimes want to scare your customers into buying software. But we really fundamentally believed that when you move to serverless, there are a lot of things that become healthier about how your application is structured.
So, Hillel, one of the themes that's been coming up in this discussion is that the cloud is different, and you mentioned also serverless being different, and that's different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse. And serverless is also, I think, interesting because it's not like it's not like people or organizations can move from serverless that they're running in their data center to lift and shift it into the cloud. This is actually something that's new with its own new patterns. So what have you seen there in terms of security being different, and either on the optimistic side as it's better, or it's still challenges that organizations have to look out for?
Sure. I think obviously the fundamental difference when you move to the cloud is this sort of notion of the shared responsibility model, and the fact that as you move into the cloud provider, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Google or anybody else, they've got a set of responsibilities and a set of tools they're going to provide and a set of things they're going to own in terms of security and operations and deployment. And then you've got a set of responsibilities that you have, and those are different than the things you had when you were living in the on-prem enterprise world. Now, beyond that, when we talk about serverless, and maybe the more broadly cloud native, the way I like to think of it is it's sort of adopting the cloud as an operating system. So if you take that paradigm, until now we've been looking at the cloud as a way to source hardware. So we didn't want to buy machines and deal with operating machines, and so we use the cloud, and that's great. But now we're saying, actually, we want to look at the cloud as an operating system. We want to build software that runs on the cloud, and that's why, to your point, there's very little lift and shift in these worlds. Whether it's serverless and functions, or even in a lot of the sort of more modern ways we're doing microservices and containers, we're seeing less and less lift and shift, less and less, let me take something I built for some other platform and get it running here, and more, let me look at this platform as an operating system, and let me think about how I build software for that. Let me take advantage of the things that this platform can give me and not rewrite things that are already written. And that's really the cloud native and serverless ethos is, take things that are managed and then put your business logic in there to put them together. When it comes to security, that means a bunch of things. First of all, it means that a lot of the places we put security in the past, they don't necessarily work all that well for us. So if we're thinking about the perimeter as a place to put security, that becomes challenging in a cloud native and serverless world where data can flow in and out of applications in all sorts of different ways. And it's really difficult to sort of map out a really nice tight perimeter and say, okay, all the bad things are going to come through this front door. I'm going to put security here and I'm going to scan it and find it. Now we've got this much more complex application, getting triggers from all sorts of directions, interacting with lots and lots of third-party services, and every one of those potentially could be a point of ingress for malicious data. And so we really need to think differently about where we want to put our security and where we want to set it up. But then also a lot of the places we used to use and leverage for security real estate don't work anymore. We don't necessarily own the operating system or the runtimes of these platforms. And so we can't necessarily install the agents and the SE Linuxes and things like that we used to get security. So in a lot of ways that requires us to sort of reimagine not the threats, because the threat landscape, for the most part, is very similar to what it was previously in the cloud. Certainly, cloud threats are different than on-prem threats. But more than that, when we go to cloud native and serverless, we need to sort of reimagine, well, what kind of security do I want? Where am I going to put it so it's meaningful for me? How am I going to operate it? That's the challenging part. The upside for us is really when you embrace this model of code as business logic and managed resources and gluing applications together in this sort of way that serverless and cloud native does, a lot of things in security become easier. For example, answering questions about whether A and B should be talking becomes easier because A is something that you know and B is something that you know, and these things are labeled. If B is a database and A is a function, it's really clear to make a decision about whether a function should be talking to a database, as opposed to kind of the old world where we had this pile of containers or VMs and we didn't really know what they were, and it was difficult for security teams to make policy about that, certainly at the speed that's required to protect the cloud. So in that sense, a lot of the things that we used to do manually can be done more in a more automated way. A lot of the things that we did very coarse-grained can be done very fine-grained. And one of the things that we focus on a lot in Protego, and I think is really valuable now that we come into the Dome 9 ecosystem of Checkpoint, is the ability to drive towards least privilege. And that's really powerful in the cloud. If you can drive everything to least privilege, you can get a lot of security that was hard to get in the past. And that's something that's more challenging to do in the non-cloud native, non-serverless world where you have these big monoliths and go figure out how to apply some sort of least privilege to a monolith.
Yeah, that's got to be really challenging, though. So, because I can imagine that's a great example just to say, here is a function that reads from the database, and here's a function that maybe needs to write to the database. And with serverless, you can start to say, cool, actually, rather than this particular service that talks to the database, that's container to container or VM to VM, like you were saying, this is actually the one serverless function, and all it does is read. And this is the other function, all it does is write. So you can really do a lot of decomposition. But I'm going to guess that starts to get, once we start talking about anything more complex than read and write into a database, trying to track that fine-grained access control becomes pretty difficult. So what are some ways that somebody might approach that, though, and be successful at it?
Yeah, first of all, you're spot on. Usually the conversation, it takes about 20 seconds usually for the cloud security architect to go from, oh, wow, I could set any of the 5,200 different API permissions for each of my functions, and I could apply those permissions to each particular individual resource. So I can say this function only needs to write to this particular table and only needs to read from that particular bucket. That's super powerful. And then it takes about 20 seconds for him to go, I mean, I have 170 functions in my account. I have to make a decision for every one, and then they change 2-3 times a week. Forget it. I give up, right? And so you're right. The carrot and and the stick come together here. What we've really focused on, and I think this is proving to be more and more valuable, and I think others are going to follow suit, is automating this process by leveraging all of the complex data that's available to us. So one of the things that people often don't notice is that as we've shifted to the cloud, and as we've shifted to microservices and then serverless, and as we've shifted especially to configuration as code, some of the things that were sort of opaque are now available to us as data. So we can start looking at not just what machines are there, but hey, what does the code say those machines do? And what does the configuration say they're allowed to connect to? And where are they supposed to be running? And what are they meant to be interacting with? And all of that information can be automated into a process where we can say, hey, you're right. It's really challenging to figure out what's least privilege for every piece of the architecture as it shifts 2-3 times a day or a week. But if we can automate that process, so 99.9% of those decisions can be made automatically, and then we can allow our security people just to focus on those edge cases where we say, well, that's something special, we want to think about that, then we're going to be able to get to that value of least privilege without the sort of mass suicide of security professionals.
Yeah, I think that one of the sounds like a carrot in the cliff rather than a carrot in the stick.
But Hillel, you bring up a really interesting benefit of DevOps is because everything is code. The creation of the infrastructure it's running on all through YAML files and all the different configuration files. What we've done is we've documented it in a way that security's never seen it before. See, security didn't have access to how these applications were configured because it was this one big monolithic piece of code. But DevOps, by breaking this stuff up, embedding everything into this code, it actually gave security professionals an opportunity to get visibility into the application that we've never had before. And if we can truly look at those configuration files and really understand what's going on, we can actually do a lot better job of securing an application before it moves in production because we have that visibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the revolution that Dome 9 and some of those other companies brought to the cloud space was exactly that, was this notion that, hey guys, there's so much information available now in the way that you're deploying applications and in the fact that that stuff is now documented, as you said, in a meaningful and machine readable way, that we can now bridge the gap between security people and DevOps and dev in a way that lets security people understand what's happening, build compliance rules, build security posture, things like that. When we started Protego, one of the things we wrote in one of our first slides was we're going to be Dome 9 for code, meaning we're going to be that world of I want to read configuration, but we want to go a step further. We want to read code. Because the thing that security people were talking to us and saying was, hey, I have no idea what this application does. And I'm not going to go do a code review, even if I could, for every piece of code a developer writes, every time he changes it 3 or 4 times a day. I can't keep up with that. That's not my job. It's not my skill set. On the other hand, how do I make decisions about what I want to enable or not enable, or whether I want to trust a developer who I've handed those keys over to if I don't know what this application does? And to us, one of the real key insights was, hey, but wait a minute, all of this code is there. It's part of the application. It's documented. It's part of the process. We can automate the process of understanding what this code wants to do and say, okay, if this code wants to connect to a database in this particular database and do a read on it, and we understand that was the developer's intent, that might be something we want to allow, or maybe it's something we don't want to allow. But if this code doesn't want to connect to a database, then why would we allow it to do that? Let's make sure it can't do that. Let's build its security profile that way. And so bridging that gap of saying, okay, yeah, configuration, that's step one. Code, that's step two. And in a world where you're like serverless, where all you own is data, configuration, and code, you don't own runtime or operating system or network. None of those things are meaningful to you. When you think about security, that's what you're thinking about. You're thinking about, okay, what's my configuration? Is it optimal? What does the code say I want to do? And how do I translate that into good decision making? Where's my data? Is it secure? Those are your decisions.
App user data. I've been saying it for almost 5 years now. No, over 5 years. App user data. That's what we control in a cloud native world. That's all we got.
Yep.
So let me try one on for you. When I was looking at your guys' website over the weekend, it was an interesting read because, I think, and I'm still trying to figure out, what serverless security means to me. So I think this is an interesting conversation for me and for our listeners. My first thought was go straight down, zooming into thinking about actual AppSec, right? So OWASP top 10 type things, more sort of focused around that. But the sense I got from your website is you guys sort of focus around 3 sort of areas. We've been talking today around, as you said, Dome 9 for a function, I'll say. But you're also looking at vulnerability management as well as some of that more AppSec-y type things. Do you feel one of those is more important or something needs to be covered, that there's a better bang for the buck in one of those 3 over the others, or any thoughts between? Because it's interesting to think about it. It's not just one thing, right? It's that combination of the 3.
Yeah. So when we started, I really tried to build a model that said AppSec, traditional AppSec is not important because in a world where everything is very fine-grained and very nuanced and where we can understand the meaning of everything, we could build security posture that would simply make the bad things not happen. And as we did that, and we made a lot of really great steps in that direction, and as you mentioned, a big part of what our product is able to do is understand proper configuration, understand the right IAM roles automatically, do vulnerability management, things like that. But the thing we realized was, yeah, that's great, and it's super valuable. And I made the argument, and I'll stand by it, that doing posture correctly in a serverless application has far more bang to buck than it does in a traditional monolithic application, because least privilege is really meaningful in serverless, where functions do very little, right? And your ability to drive to that least privilege is more powerful and more available automatically than it was in a world where applications are really complex and hard to track. So that's great. But when it comes down to brass tacks, what you realize is there are still bad things that can happen to an application that we can't mitigate just by trying to put the right doors and windows into the house. We actually have to have active defense as well. And so what ended up happening was we couldn't get away from the need to solve the sort of OWASP top 10 runtime security problem. And so what we did was we turned around and said, okay, well, what does it mean to do that in the serverless world? And then there were two issues. One issue was where do you put your WAF? How do you scale it right? If you want to do something like runtime, like RASP or something, where would you install that? You can't put agents into your Java runtime. You can't put things in the operating system. So how do we reimagine that for serverless, in a way it's stateless, ephemeral, and meaningful? But that was the challenge part. But then there was the opportunity part, which was, okay, when we finally embraced the fact that we can't get away from AppSec, we looked at AppSec for serverless. We said, wait a minute, we can do AppSec for serverless in a way that we've been dreaming about doing it for containers and VMs for years. We've always been talking about whitelisting the right behaviors rather than blacklisting the bad behaviors, and it's always been a struggle. There's a million products out there saying I'm going to do anomaly detection on your macro containers and figure out what if they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. But as we all know, it's really hard to turn that into something that blocks bad things because just the signal to noise ratio is terrible. But here, when we start talking about fine-grained resources that usually do the same thing every time, and where we can actually profile them before they run by understanding what they do, and then build that together with runtime profiling. Can't we build a model where zero configuration, I call it auto segmentation, this notion of high level, application level microsegmentation, but automatically, because I can't possibly microsegment every behavior every piece of code is going to do manually. But if I can do that automatically, and I can base it on information that's meaningful and it's going to give me very low false positive rates, then I can be in a world where I can tackle the AppSec problem as well alongside the posture. I can base both of those things on top of this understanding of what code does and what code needs to do. And I can solve those two problems in a way that's going to let me sleep at night without hiring 1,000 people. That was our, don't hire 1,000 people. That was our tagline.
Don't hire 1,000 people. It sounds familiar, John, right?
A little bit, yes.
Yes. And to do that, you have to be in the application. You have to understand the application. It can't be a black box anymore. And I think that's part of the challenges with a traditional AppSec approach is we always treated the application like a black box. In the model you just laid out, it can't be a black box anymore. You have to understand the application from the inside out in order to put these whitelist rules in place to enforce behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I totally agree with that. I think fundamentally, for years as security people, the way that we treated developers was they were children running with scissors, right? They were going to do stupid things. They were incapable of doing anything normal and useful. And our job was to wrap their stuff in this security bubble wrap in a way that when they screw up inevitably, we're going to try to pad the application in a way so it won't do anything terrible. We'll put a WAF in front of it and an agent underneath it. We'll put some sort of database firewall behind it. And hopefully between all those layers of security, the stupid application will not malfunction in a way that's going to put us at too much of a risk. I think that model doesn't work, and we know it. And we've known it for a long time, but when you go to serverless, you just have no choice but to recognize that, because all you're left with is the application. So if you're not going to have a conversation with developers and DevOps people about how you work together on security, then you're just not doing security. So that's the place where you go, oh, okay, I got to change my mindset. I think that mindset needs to change everywhere. I don't think it's true that in the VM world, you should be thinking about the application as a malicious black box you have to defend yourself from. But I think that here we really recognize that there's no other choice, and there's an opportunity to do it right. There's an opportunity to embrace developers. And at the same time, let's recognize the fact that in the cloud native world, developers have more and more power. Configuration as code also means that developers are doing things that classically they couldn't do. They could, create machines. They can change the network in code. And we have to recognize that they have a lot more power. We can't take that power away from them because that's going to slow them down, and that's just not what the business wants. But we have to figure out a way to get the most security. And I think part of that is really embracing the application, embracing the developer process. And maybe just to throw one more thing, which I'll talk about for another hour, is embracing the pipeline, right? For security. And that's something I've talked about a lot. And I think that the notion of the pipeline as being friendly to security, DevSecOps has been maligned and over discussed. But I really think here's the place when you go to the cloud where, hey, there isn't a lot of gating between when a developer writes a line of code and when some customer's using it. So if you're not thinking about the pipeline as the place to validate security in a way that's automated, then you're probably going to be launching things into the production environment that aren't secure, and then hopefully catching them later and doing something about it.
Yes, very true.
Yeah. Excuse me. That's a fantastic look at it because, just to repeat a little bit of what you were saying, this serverless focus is very code-centric approach to AppSec rather than the black box of what is going on with this app, and let's wrap it up with some types of tools. With that said, when we're talking, a lot of what you were describing here too has been what is the app doing, what does it need to connect to, what does this function need to operate on in terms of data or interact with another service, for example. How much of this insight can come from the cloud service provider, and how much of it perhaps becomes more of a responsibility for the developers to build in a lot of monitoring or logging themselves in order to enable a lot of this information collection so you can get to this analysis for least privilege type of access?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have the right answer. We've taken an approach which tries to avoid having to put additional security responsibilities on developers. To be honest, as someone who was a developer for many years, it's mostly because that hasn't ever really worked, not because it's not a good idea. So it's quite possible that as the world evolves, we do need to think about saying to developers, hey, you guys need to be responsible for giving us more data, whether it's logging or marking up code or explaining to us in a way that the machine can read where malicious data could come from and where it's headed to and things like that. So I don't want to discount that. Obviously developers are super capable people at solving lots of other problems. There's no reason why they can't be part of the security equation. Having said that, we've so far tried to avoid as much of that as possible. We've tried to be in a situation where we're saying, look, you guys, you do what you need to do to create value. And honestly, the reason I believe in that is because I think security and development are kind of fundamentally different in mindset. As a developer, you're trying to rapidly create something. You're trying to build something that works. It's the same reason why developers tend to do a lousy job at testing their own applications, despite the sort of DevOps world that we try to put them in. Because when I'm thinking about the application, I'm thinking about how I want it to work, not how someone else might make it not work. And so putting the responsibility on a developer to say, hey, as you write that code, also figure out what's the ramification of giving that code this permission, and think about whether that's something you need or not, and could you live with less or not. That's tough. I'm not saying it can't be done. I don't want to discount that, but we've taken the approach that says, hey, the developers do what they need to do, and we're going to build a system that can leverage the fact that there's so much data available already in their code and in the metadata, and turn that into security policy. But I'm not a purist there. Like, I do believe there's room for solutions to come and say, hey, if a developer can take responsibility for certain things, we can get a lot more security, and we should embrace that model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the other thing too is that there's an underlying aspect that the developers perhaps there's additional speed that comes from this, especially if they're just saying all we need to care about is the code, and we need to just make an adjustment here in this one particular function or this one particular Lambda, for example, and we don't need to worry about the rest of the stack at all that is underneath it. And in fact, the security team doesn't need to worry about the rest of that stack underneath it as well. So it's really just, here's a line of code. Code goes out, make sure that there's some testing for the least privilege is being enforced. And actually, we now have a asset inventory that's literally just within our code repo of all of the lines of code for our app, rather than trying to come up with an asset inventory of the apps themselves or wrangling containers. So I just wanted to throw that out as some other things that I'm going to guess are possibly some emerging benefits that would come out of this type of approach too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think one of the things I'm seeing, which surprised me at first in our space, and I'm seeing it across a lot of different products and a lot of different companies, I kind of expected the usual reaction to security tools is, okay, as a developer, I get it. You need to do what you need to do. DevOps guys tend to say something like, I'm okay with carving out some space for security in the pipeline, as long as security will be responsible for that space, and that's okay. And I expected developers to say, all right, I understand that security is trying to make my life difficult, and whatever, it's just a tax I have to pay. What I've seen much more than I expected is developers wanting access to these tools. Developers wanting to be able to look at that inventory and say, I actually want to be able to access the CloudGuard system as well. I want to be able to see what's in my application and make sure that all that makes sense. Maybe I want to do run some compliance in that myself. In our world, when we went from doing sort of a cloud-based assessment of posture for serverless applications to shifting that into the pipeline as well, our intention was to allow security to have more control earlier in the process. But the thing that we didn't expect was developers were saying, hey, wait a minute. So instead of me getting some, error in production in something running from some security tool that blocked something, which I now have to go trace, now the pipeline can tell me before it goes out, hey, there's a problem with your code. It's provisioned to do this thing where it's got a vulnerable library, whatever it is. That's fantastic. And then they immediately went to, wait, why do I have to wait for the pipeline? Can I run that locally? So we had to turn around and give them a version to run on their desktops so they could do the same evaluation locally. So I think developers do understand that there's a value in engaging with some of these tools and processes. And I don't want to say developers can never be part of the solution. I absolutely don't believe in that. I also don't believe in some of the solutions I've seen out there which have said, hey, let's just give application level firewalls to developers. Let's let them write code in each of their functions or containers that says, I need to do this and I need to do that, and make them be really explicit and not allow them to do wildcards and things like that. I think at some point, if you're creating work for developers, you're adding a lot of time to their day to spend on security. That's taking away from what they really should be doing. So it's that balance. But I do think that developers understand there's value in these tools, there's value in the visibility it gives them, there's value in being able to understand where these things are, and there's value in solving things earlier rather than later. Those are things that as a developer speak really well to me. And I've seen every developer we've interacted with where I expected reticence for them to say, no, absolutely not, give it to me. But I also want access to it, and I want it earlier, and I want it on my machine, and I want it now. And why can't I get syntax underlined in my ID?
Yeah, and they want it in their tools. Yeah. They want it in the interfaces they're in every day. They don't want to have to log into a third-party security tool to go get that data. So as security practitioners, we need to be able to hand that data back to them into their tools, because if they get it, like you said, they'll do something about it. They'll fix it. It's just we have to be a lot more forthcoming with the data, make it really easy for them to consume.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, you've made it really easy to have a fun and great conversation, Hillel. So thank you for joining us. This was good.
It was a pleasure. I hope you'll have me back.
I think we're going to have you back for sure. And I want to thank Matt and John for joining us as well. We're going to take a quick break now, and then we're going to return with news of the week.